Hey Chris, thank you for joining us at Stanford Blockchain.
Hi, Jay. How are you? Thanks for having me.
You're doing great as well. Yeah, so congrats on putting out this new book, Read, Write, Own. Would love to learn more about so how you think about like crypto as well as why this book kind of begins with the history of the internet. Why do you think it's important for us to understand blockchains in the broader context of internet history and in particular network economies?
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a long time, I've been a long time in this space, and I've spoken to a lot of people, including a lot of people who aren't as familiar with kind of the internet and the history of the internet and haven't worked on the internet. And what I discovered in that process was that I felt like there really needed to be a book that kind of from first principles walk through, sort of how kind of the internet works, not on a technical level, but on kind of on an in terms of business, economics, and control of the internet. And specifically, I think this is sort of something that's taken for granted by what I'm about to say is taken for granted by internet veterans, but it's not obvious to the rest of the world, which is the following: the internet is a network of networks. It's so the sort of base internet is a software based system internet protocol. And then what we do with the internet, what we, meaning entrepreneurs and builders and others, do is build networks on top. So, for example, the World Wide Web is a network on top of the internet. Email is a network on top of the internet. Twitter is a network on top of the internet. Facebook is a network. And so, I've been doing internet entrepreneurship and investing for 25 years. And that's what you do as an entrepreneur or an investor, is you try to either create a new network or invest in a new network, right? And so that's when I talk about the history, what I'm really trying to do is kind of illustrate that kind of, that's a very important concept, because fast forward, what are blockchains? Blockchains are it's a technology that allows you to build networks in a new way. Okay. And so to sort of a prerequisite for understanding why that would be important is understanding the internet, this idea that the internet is a network of networks, right? And then specifically, the way I kind of structure the book is I think there's sort of three important kind of ways you can build networks, sort of network designs. There's the network designs from the very early internet in the 80s and 90s, and most notably the World Wide Web, which is the protocol called HTTP, and email, which is a protocol called SMTP, which of course are still around today and still popular. But what's important about them is the book is not talking about the technical design. I'm not as concerned with that. It's more that the way it's designed ends up affecting how the money and power flows through the network. Okay. So specifically, the way that, for example, the World Wide Web is designed is that you can go and put up a website and, buy a domain name, put up a website, and you fully own that website, and there's nobody sitting in between you and the audience. So if somebody comes to your website, you can decide to show them ads, you can charge them money, you can make it free, you can do whatever you want. Okay. In contrast to lots of other networks, if I put a page up on TikTok or on Facebook or some other, kind of corporate, what I call corporate networks, the corporate owner, Facebook, TikTok, et cetera, they have all the power. They decide what the rules are. They decide how to throttle your traffic, like, hey, you're getting too popular, I'm going to turn a dial inside, hey, I'm not going to share my revenue with you, which, by the way, they don't. For the vast majority of the big networks, corporate networks do not share revenue with their users. And so they have full control. You're playing in their playground. And that's a function of the way the network is architected, right? So I spent a lot of my career trying to support these open networks, these protocol networks. And specifically, for example, there was a very important one called RSS, which essentially was an open version of Facebook and Twitter and sort of all of these social networks today, and got pretty popular in the late 2000s, and I believe, had RSS become the dominant way in which people use social networking today, we'd have a very different internet. We'd have an internet where, there's the revenue of the top 5 social networks last year was 150 billion with a B dollars. Almost all of that money went to those corporate owners. Had RSS been the winner, that money would have flowed instead to the edges of the network, to the users of the network, to the creators and users and developers. And so it's very, very important. I think, people can think I'm crazy about blockchains and hate crypto, whatever they want to do, but they should understand this point, which is that network design is destiny on the internet, right?
Right.
Like how you build the network is how it's sort of the train tracks that decide how the money and how the control flows. Okay. And that's not really a disputed point among internet people, even people that are skeptical of blockchains. But I realized in talking to people that that point had not kind of been made. And I felt it's very important to make that point. So that's why I talk about the history. It's not sort of to, you know, to reminisce or to, you know, go into technical details. It's really getting to this point, which is, hey, this is the thing that determines how money and power flows, right? And so then what are blockchains? Blockchains are software constructions that let you build new networks that have very interesting properties. And specifically, what I think is exciting about blockchains is that they have what I argue is the societal benefits of these open protocol networks, these early networks like the World Wide Web, but have much more advanced ability to compete with networks like Facebook and Twitter through features, through funding, and through a sort of, and in order to understand this, you have to kind of diagnose why did RSS fail, and I have a whole little section on that. And I think it came down to basically two things: features and funding. All right, so like, you know, I use a case study of YouTube. YouTube spent many billions of dollars subsidizing their growth. So what, you know, they basically, their initial value proposition to users and creators was, you can host video on our website for free.
Yeah.
And video was very expensive to host, and it still is very expensive to host. It's gotten cheaper, but it was, you know, it's still, you know, but so the video's gotten bigger, and it ends up being expensive, and they subsidize that. Why do they subsidize that? And then that you know, that's why all of these, and they have huge development teams and they have sales teams, and that's why all of these big, you know, companies, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, raised many billions of dollars, and either venture markets or once they were acquired, like in the case of YouTube by Google. It's very expensive to build a network, and that's a big reason why these open networks have mostly, you know, we have these early ones, the web and email, but all the new attempts like RSS have failed because it's just like, it's very hard to compete against these incredibly well-funded corporate networks. One of the really interesting things with blockchains is that they can be these open networks, but they can also, through tokens and other mechanisms, have their own kind of native funding sources.
Yeah, that sounds
And I walk
great.
through this.
Absolutely.
I walk through all that in detail. Sorry, and so that's kind of the reason I go through the history. Sorry.
Yeah, that sounds great. I think it's super important for us to like place it in the context, to place like blockchains in the context of the broader internet history as well. So you discuss how there's like two distinct cultures in blockchain. There's the computer culture, and then there's the casino culture. So to what extent do you think that they're like mutually dependent? Could the computer survive without the casino, or like vice versa?
Yeah, so just to give a little more background on that. So, you know, the distinction I make, so a lot of people, when they think of crypto and blockchains, they think of FTX, they think of speculation, you know, they read articles. It seems like these people are just, you know, gambling. And there's some truth to those complaints. That does happen. I think that you know, I live in another world, which is a different side of it, which is this, what I call the computer, which is you know, me and all the entrepreneurs that we're involved with and that we fund, you know, are people who have a vision that's much more aligned with the book, and that's one reason I wrote the book, is to give the full kind of computer vision, which is, you know, that the key concept is that you can build these networks and systems where users and creators and kind of the participants in the network can be genuine owners. And like, as a byproduct of ownership, if you think about the real world, like you can own your house, you can own sneakers. A byproduct of ownership is you can buy and sell them, and sometimes there's speculation, and that happens in every market where there's ownership. But in the kind of vision that I have, and that the people that are like-minded have, that is a byproduct, which, by the way, you know, the government should put guardrails around. Nobody's arguing that this shouldn't be regulated. And I think the right regulation could, you know, same as we have in other markets, like housing markets. But that's a secondary byproduct. That the real thing is about creating networks that have, you know, that have these new properties and make users and creators genuine owners in the network. That's the kind of key innovation. And one thing I would mention too is, like, you know, this movement has been around now for 15 years. A lot of skeptics have thought it would go away. I think we can see that it just continues to be strong. People continue to be excited about it. People say it's like a bubble or something. I don't think there's an example in modern history of a bubble lasting 15 years. Beanie Babies was 3 years. Internet bubble was probably at the peak at least 3 years. Real estate bubble about 3 years. Tulip bubble 3 years. I submit that at some point, 15 years into it, with lots of people like me, like you, all of my friends, tons of people I know, the data shows many tens of millions of people are in this camp. At some point, I would submit that the critics should consider that something else is going on here. And I think what's going on here is that people are tired of doing the work and building networks that are owned by companies who then, kind of exert their control, take all the money. And, Bitcoin was the first example of this, where Bitcoin is a financial service that's owned and operated by the users, by the community. They own it. There's no company that owns it. And that's a very exciting idea to a lot of people. And then Ethereum and other new kind of systems have taken that and expanded that. And I believe that's what's happening. That's why this has persisted for 15 years, and it'll persist for another 15 years, another 50 years. And the question before us as a society is, do we channel that energy into something constructive, or do we just allow it to kind of degenerate into a bunch of gambling and speculation, which does exist, and I think needs to be kind of controlled and tamped down. So, but look, I think it's a prerequisite for kind of doing that, for kind of saying, okay, well, how do we help the computer and how do we minimize the gambling and all the other kinds of things, is understanding the vision. And that's why I wrote this book. I wanted to write a book that was a complete vision. What is the positive, constructive kind of case for blockchains? And so now that's, now that at least that exists, there's a book that someone can read that has that kind of complete vision. They may or may not agree with it, but like, this is the vision. And I think it's a very positive vision. I think it's a socially productive vision. I think that it counters a lot of very disturbing trends on the internet, specifically how consolidated the internet has become. I go through this in the intro of the book. There's sort of 5 companies that have the vast majority of control of the internet. And I think that will only accelerate with the rise of technologies like AI, which I'm very excited about. AI, I think it's a very positive technology for the most part, but it's a centralizing technology, rewards companies with large stores of data and capital.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think like you also talk about like the significance of tokens in coordinating online behavior and how this is the way that like blockchains allow for a new form of ownership. What are some of like your favorite examples of this sort of using tokens to coordinate mass behavior that could not have been achieved previously in the digital realm?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, it's, going to the kind of the big, most popular examples would be things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. I think what to me, Ethereum is a particularly exciting project. Ethereum, it took kind of the ideas of Bitcoin, which is you can have a digital service that's owned and operated by the community, and said, well, what if you made that digital service just sort of a general purpose computer that anyone could build applications for? So it's kind of analogous to when Apple introduced the App Store for the iPhone, right? So Ethereum kind of said anyone can build an app for this thing.
Yeah.
And then what's cool about it is if you build an app for Ethereum, it has the same, it sort of, the app itself inherits those properties of Ethereum, meaning it also can be kind of owned and operated by the community. So there's no company behind Ethereum. It's this computer in the sky that anyone can access and nobody owns. And that's just a very new, powerful, kind of interesting idea. And to the extent there are owners, it's people that hold the tokens, right? And there's an economic model. A lot of people say, oh, this is all just based on, the value is just based on, belief and hype and everything else. This is just factually incorrect in the case of things like Ethereum, which has a real economic model. You pay money to access the system in the way you would in an old school mainframe system, and that money then goes back to the token holders. And so like Ethereum is, and it's a very, I think, generally a very strong and positive community. It's a community that's interested in building applications. So that that's an example. I think I mentioned in the book, I think another interesting example is Uniswap. I think Uniswap is interesting because they did basically set up a model where I believe it's 60% of the tokens of kind of the ownership of the network go to the users. And specifically, they did a retroactive airdrop, which means sort of after the product had been out for 2 years, gave tokens to anyone who'd used the product for the prior 2 years. I think it was 15% of the total tokens, which is really just kind of a, it's as if like Facebook, a couple of years into its existence, said, hey, we're going to, instead of having kind of hoarding all the ownership among the executives and the VCs, we're going to give it to all the people that really made this network. Users make these networks. These social networks are created by the users, right? Marketplaces are created by, like, the hosts created Airbnb, the creators created YouTube, right? I mean, the content providers create these networks. And so I think a really interesting thing that happens in these blockchain networks is that people are experimenting with new ways in which the community can really own it, and you can make sure that you reward the people who contribute the most and the most, the highest quality, the most constructive content. People are using that model for other things. I talk about it in the book a little bit. There's a whole movement called DePIN, decentralized physical infrastructure. That's like pretty cool, which is you sort of take these things like electric car charging or cellular networks, things that are right now controlled by big companies like Verizon control cellular networks. And there's a project called Helium that is building a kind of a grassroots cellular network. So anyone can put up a device in their house and join the network and be part of it. And they get rewarded through token rewards for doing that. And so they kind of get real kind of economic and governance rights in the network for doing that. And so that just like a bunch of ideas that sort of basically, to me, this is what the internet was supposed to be. This is what the internet was in the 90s. This was the vision this is why I joined the internet and spent my career on it. Is I found this a deeply appealing idea that there would be this network that didn't have a company behind it, that would be owned by the community, by the users.
Right.
And that was true in the 90s. And I think that led to so much sort of this really important golden age of innovation. So this is not just some like kind of wistful ideal. This is actually, I think, has real important economic and cultural consequences. And then I think that's at serious risk now. And to me, tokens are a really important mechanism for returning the internet to this roots of being community owned and operated. To make something community owned, you need a means by which they own it. That's what a token is. A token is a means by which the community members can actually own a part of the digital service that they contribute to.
Yeah, that's super important. You also describe blockchain as currently undergoing its iPhone moment. So why now? And how do you think blockchain technologies might evolve in tandem with other frontier technologies? I know we mentioned AI, but also let's say robotics and like VR and these emerging fields.
Yeah, no, so just to clarify, I don't think I don't think blockchains have yet had their iPhone moment. And so by the iPhone moment, what I mean is, just sort of, if you go back through the history of computing, kind of every computing phase has kind of this incubation phase where kind of people are playing around and building stuff, and there's some apps that get some traction. But then there's sort of, generally there's like kind of a big moment where there's sort of a quote killer app. And that was sort of the iPhone for mobile computing. Went back to I had friends doing it in the 90s. There was serious efforts in the early 2000s, but it was 2007 with the iPhone, it really boomed and hit. I think like AI, I mean, the first neural network paper was 1943. And I started an AI company in 2008. I was too early. It was, there's a long history of people trying to build stuff there. Ultimately, it was this kind of interesting thing that happened, which is GPUs got better and better because of video games. And it turned out GPUs also were really good at neural networks. And then, some really innovative people like OpenAI came along and, took all of that, and boom, you had ChatGPT. And I think that's pretty clearly the iPhone moment for AI. I don't think we've had it yet. I think, look, there's a lot of reasons why, and I go through in the book. I think that it's on the near-term horizon, and there's a bunch of, promising projects. And, look, if you look at the AI analogy, like a lot of it, like, not taking away from, I think, a lot of great entrepreneurship, including, Sam Altman and OpenAI and a bunch of others. But a lot of what happened was the underlying infrastructure got better, meaning the GPUs and the computing ability allowed you to create these giant neural networks. And the same thing is here, like the underlying infrastructure has to hit some kind of tipping point where you can, can get good enough. And I spend time kind of looking at that and charting that. And I think I'm cautiously optimistic that's in the near future, but it's TBD. So no, I don't think we've had our iPhone moment, but I think we've had a lot of really cool, interesting experiments and kind of early things. There's about, I think, based on the data I see, 10 to 20 million kind of active users of blockchain networks, which is a lot of people, but is tiny in the scale of the internet. And so it's more, and they're more like technical people, like probably like you and me, and kind of early adopter types.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and then what are you most excited about for the upcoming year? I know that we're in like the beginning of a new year, and some people mentioned that it may be the beginning of a new cycle. So, what are you most excited about going forward in 2024?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's a bunch of, I think exciting projects that are launching. So some of the things I talk about in the book in the last section of the book, I go through 7 very specific. A lot of people say like, well, what problems does blockchain solve? Be more specific. So I went really specific, and I gave 7 very specific kind of areas: finance, AI, some media related things. I just kind of go through in the end of the book, and so a bunch of the things I describe in there are real, like, very strong entrepreneurs building those things and launching them. A lot of that stuff will launch in the next 12 months or so. So that's there's a bunch of infrastructure things happening that I think are important, that will lower fees and increase performance. And so just sort of seeing that charge along, I think kind of getting through, there was a really bad period of all of these terrible scandals like FTX, and consumers got hurt. And I think hopefully we're past that, hopefully kind of getting through that. I think ideally we will see kind of, I think, more sophisticated approaches to policy. That's been a big drag on the space, is just kind of, there's been a lot of lack of clarity. It's basically going to get resolved now, it looks like, in the courts, which is going to take many years. I think ideally we'd have Congress and legislative action to kind of come in and come up with a policy that says, look, here's what's good about the technology, here's what's bad about it. How do we craft a policy that allows for the good and eliminates or minimizes the bad? I think that's just a sensible way to do all tech policy, whether it's AI or blockchains or whatever. Is sort of, you have to go and understand it, see what's good about it, see what's bad about it. All technology is good, or has good and bad aspects. None of it is, there's not, I don't believe there's, a blockchain is a software construction. I don't think it's inherently good or bad or left or right. I think it's fundamentally, it has, it's a new kind of way to build a community owned computer, and you can use that in different ways. And I think we as a society should have a conversation that says, like, what are the good and bad ways? I'm trying to contribute to that with the book, and then from that, design some policy. I think we need that, because like right now, entrepreneurs in the space have to be experts in infrastructure, have to be experts in legal policy. They spend tons of money on it, legal and other things, and then at the same time try to build a popular app. It's very hard to do with all of that kind of noise and friction. And so I'm hoping over the next couple of years we'll clarify those things.
That makes sense as well.
Yeah.
Actually, I feel like one special feature in crypto is that there's also this idea of decentralized governance as well. For example, decentralized autonomous organizations, DAOs. How do you think like these DAOs and regulators can both work together in order to mitigate some of the harmful effects, such as the casino culture that you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bunch of interesting specific policy proposals out there. I think one thing I kind of allude to in the book, it's a detailed topic that I didn't go deeply into, and frankly, we have policy people who are more expert on it. But I think one very important thing generally in sort of things that involve money is time horizons. So in all startups, just to give you an example, it's always standard to have vesting and lockups and all sorts of, and blockchain when we invest in token networks, we always ask for and almost always get long-term lockups for ourselves and the founders. I think that kind of reorienting, I think a lot of the casino stuff comes from short-term thinking. If you can only realize value in something if you over a 5+ year period, or 3 years or 4 years or 7 years, whatever it might be, you're basically at that point highly incentivized to build something that's really of lasting value.
Right.
And so, and I think that's just a lesson that we've seen throughout the history of technology and maybe beyond that. And I think that's a very important concept. And it's a key kind of cornerstone part of some of the policy proposals that are out there. Just to give you one example, I think there's yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just stop there because there's a bunch more.
Yeah, we can go on for 3 hours about policy, I'm sure. Yeah. Another one final point of commonality between you and I is that we're both philosophy majors. So we'll love to just hear who's your favorite philosopher, and how has their thinking affected like this work and your work more generally?
Well, I mean, so this is a while ago, although I do try to keep up on a little bit, but yeah, I was in the kind of analytic philosophy side of things, and I liked a lot of kind of 20th century things, so philosophy of mind, philosophy of language.
Right.
So I think originally it was like the logical positivists, like Carnap and Quine and these people, and then Wittgenstein, of course, is like huge in that. And then I got into like kind of, I guess, sort of the philosophy of mind, AI, like people like Daniel Dennett and
right.
And like that kind of crowd.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, what else? Like Donald Davidson, I don't know, like that.
Yeah.
Who else? Are you
Yeah.
doing analytic, or are you doing continental? Or?
I'm doing analytic. I'm doing my honors thesis right now on Wittgenstein. So
okay. I think Wittgenstein is the most interesting 20th century.
definitely.
I've read his two main books multiple times, and
Yeah.
I also really like. Have you read the Kripke Wittgenstein?
Oh yeah. I wrote my another final on that.
Yeah, I think all of Kripke's books are great. By the way, if you haven't read it, one of my favorite books. In fact, I kind of modeled my thinking after this. Was Nelson Goodman, Fact, Fiction, and Forecast.
Oh, okay.
Read that book. That's an amazing book. And then Kripke, the private rules, whatever it's called.
Rules and
the naming
language.
necessity, of course, is great too. Anyway, that's the kind of stuff I liked. I think it's great. I mean, I think it's inherently interesting, but I also just think like the level of rigor of thinking that they have, it's so high. Like it's just so nuanced. And I think the good ones are great writers, and they're really economical in their writing, which influenced me. Like there's no, like one of the reasons I mentioned Fact, Fiction, and Forecast, and also Kripke's books, right? They're very short books.
Yeah.
They're like 150 pages, and there's like not a wasted word, and they're just really, really tight arguments.
Yeah.
And they're not, and they require some prerequisite knowledge, but they don't, they try to minimize it. And they're just genuinely new ideas. I don't know. So I really like that stuff. And I think it's just great. I think it's just great training. I did like also a lot of formal logic. I still kind of think that's interesting.
Right.
Like theory, Cantor, like,
exactly.
I don't know, all that stuff like Gödel and church Turing, all that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, Jay. It's good to hear you. Good to talk. And thanks for the
Great
time.
talking to you as well.